Sky white as old bone. Ground cracked into long, ugly lines. Late July, 1884. A young woman goes down into the dust. Della Hartman, early 20s. Lip split. Dress torn at the shoulder. She makes no sound. She does not hurry. She holds a leather ledger against her chest like it's worth something. The whole street watches. Not one person moves. Water cost more than flour that summer. Every soul on that street had troubles of their own, which is the easiest reason in the world to look away. Harlan Pike 50, heavy, loud, stands over her. He always needs a crowd. Thieving girl. Lived off my charity 6 years and stole from me for the last time. He steps closer. Your mama was the same. Ungrateful. Worthless in the shaded doorway of the trading post. A second man watches. Cut coat. Clean hands. Renner. He never raises his voice. He's never had to. Mr. Pike Harlan stops like a dog hitting the end of a chain. Whatever this is, settle it quiet. We've papers to sign before dark. The ledger, clutched to Della's chest. Cramped handwriting. A heading, estate. And one line beneath, underscored once. Land, $400. $400. Received once. From somewhere her uncle had never named. Money doesn't make itself, and it doesn't vanish without leaving a track. Harlan grabs for the ledger. Della twists away, holding on. Then a sound. Hooves. Unhurried. The north end of the road. Every head turns. A man sits his horse easy. Gideon Marsh. 30-odd. Lean, sun dark. A revolver on his hip he has not reached for. He doesn't look mad. He looks decided. He swings down. Drops the reins without looking. Walks in, hands loose at his sides. Don't touch her again. You touch her. You answer to me. This is none of your affair. This woman's my kin. She's a thief. I know what I saw. I know what this whole street saw. His eyes move, slow, across the watching faces. One by one, they find the dirt. He crouches to her level. No pity in it. Ma'am. Are you all right? Della tastes blood. Hears her mother's voice learn your numbers. A person who can read is a person nobody can cheat. She tucks the ledger tighter. I'm standing. Yes, ma'am. You are. He rises. Turns to Harlan. Quiet. Final. She's leaving now. You're going to let her. The crowd begins to thin. Bullies are only loud while somebody's listening. Harlan, an audience of nobody now, takes no step. The stranger doesn't leave. He stays. Right there at her side, in the emptying street. In the doorway, Renner's polite smile never reaches his eyes. He watches the stranger the way a man watches weather rolling in. Della's hand, flat over the word land. Who is the stranger that stopped a whole town with 4 words? And what is the $400 lie her uncle would burn the world to bury?
Della Hartman did not cry when her uncle's hand caught the side of her face. She had learned that lesson young. Crying made men like Harlan Pike hit harder. So she went down into the summer dust without a sound. Lip split, dress torn at the shoulder. The copper taste of blood already on her tongue. The whole town of Cedar Gulch watched her fall. Not one person moved. It was a Thursday, late July, 1884. The kind of heat that cracks the ground into long, ugly lines and turns ordinary people mean. The sky had gone white as old bone by 8 that morning. Water cost more than flour that summer. Cattle were dying on the open range, and everybody on that street had troubles of their own, which is the easiest reason in the world to look the other way. Della pushed herself up on one hand. She did not hurry. She had a ledger pinned under her other arm, and she held it against her chest like it was worth something. It was. Every figure in it was written in her own careful hand. 6 years of work nobody had ever paid her $1 for. Thieving girl, Harlan said. He said it loud. For the crowd. He always needed a crowd. Lived off my charity 6 years and stole from me for the last time. He stepped toward her. Your mama was the same. Ungrateful. Worthless. No better than a. That's enough. The voice wasn't loud. That was the strange part. It didn't shout, and it didn't shake. It just landed, flat and certain, and it stopped. Harlan Pike, with his mouth still open. Every head on the street turned north. A man sat his horse easy at the end of the road, like he'd been in the saddle most of his life, and had nowhere he needed to be in a hurry. Maybe 34. Lean, sundark, reading the whole street with a calm that was somehow worse than anger. He wore a dark vest, sleeves rolled at the forearm, a revolver on his hip he had not reached for. He did not look mad. He looked decided. He swung down in one smooth motion, dropped the reins over the rail without looking, and he walked toward Harlan with his hands loose at his sides. Don't touch her again, he said. You touch her, you answer to me. Harlan blinked. He outweighed the stranger by 30 pounds. He had 2 men loitering at his back. He drew himself up the way bullies do when they've always had a crowd to hide behind. This is none of your affair, he said. This woman's my kin. She's a thief. I'll handle her how I know. Just the one word. Flat as a stone dropped in still water. You don't know what she's done. Harlan's voice climbed now. You don't know what I know what I saw, the man said. I know what this whole street saw. And he let his eyes move, slow across the watching faces. That was the part Della would remember a long time. Several people looked away. A woman with a market basket dropped her gaze to the dirt. One man found something fascinating about his own boots. Nobody could meet that look, because that look named the thing they'd all been doing. They'd been watching, and watching is a choice too. My name's Gideon Marsh, the man said, and something moved through the crowd at that. A low murmur Della didn't understand yet. And I'm asking this young woman if she needs help. He turned to her. He didn't look at her with pity. She'd have known what to do with pity. He looked at her plain, level, like her answer actually mattered, and he was prepared to stand there in the heat until she gave it. Ma'am, he said, are you all right? Della became aware of the blood drying on her lip, of the flour dust in her hair, of 30-some people watching her from the safety of doing nothing. She was not all right. She hadn't been all right in 6 years. I'm standing, she said. Something crossed Gideon Marsh's face. Not a smile. Something quieter and more serious than a smile. Yes, ma'am, he said. You are. He turned back to Harlan. She's leaving now. You're going to let her. She's got nowhere to go. Harlan's voice had lost something. It was reaching for solid ground and not finding it. She's got nothing. Nobody. Be back by dark. Begging. She won't be, Gideon said, and Harlan did not take another step. The crowd thinned. Bullies are only loud while somebody's listening. And the street had stopped listening. Della watched the fury drain out of her uncle's face and curdle into something smaller. The sulk of a man who knows he's lost the room. Gideon spoke to her again, quieter now. The street didn't need to hear it. I'm riding out to my ranch in 20 minutes, he said. I could use somebody who can keep supply ledgers, works honest, pays fair. He paused. If that's no interest to you, I understand, and I'll see you safe wherever you're headed. Either way, You're not staying here. Della had learned not to trust offers. Kindness from strangers usually came wrapped around a price you couldn't see until it was too late to set it down. She looked at his hands, still loose at his sides. He hadn't come a step closer than he needed to. You said fair pay, she said. What does that mean? Specifically, something shifted in his eyes. Might have been the start of respect. $50 a week, room and board. Same as my head cook. She did the arithmetic in 3 seconds flat. That's more than your cook ought to be taking. Then, going rate for bookkeeping in this territory is closer to $2. Gideon Marsh looked at her a long moment. $2 a week, he said, plus room and board. And I keep my own accounts. And my Sundays. Done. She breathed out through her nose. She looked back at the trading post, with Pike's Crossing, peeling off the door. At her uncle, red-faced and beaten, an audience of nobody now. Then she looked down at the ledger in her arms. She remembered, all at once. Certain entries in there, old ones, 2 years back. Figures in Harlan's own hand, under a heading he'd labeled estate. Amounts that had never matched any invoice she'd been handed. Money coming in from somewhere he'd never once mentioned. Her mother had told her, near the end, learn your numbers. Della. A person who can read is a person nobody can cheat forever. She tucked the ledger tighter. I'll need 5 minutes to get my things, she said. Take 10, said Gideon Marsh. She walked back past her uncle without looking at him. And as she went, she was already following a thread. She didn't yet have a name for back through 6 years, into the dark, toward whatever was waiting at the other end of those numbers. She did not know yet how far that thread would run, or how many people it would set free before it was through. The road to Stillwater Ranch ran 14 miles north, and it offered no shade and no conversation, and Della was grateful for both. She did not try to fill the quiet. Neither did Gideon Marsh. He rode a little ahead of her. Enough to lead, not enough to forget she was there. Twice in the first hour, he glanced back, not fussing over her, just the brief, level look of a man who'd taken on something and meant to see it through. Both times she met his eyes square. Both times he faced front again without a word. She was not used to silence being offered to her like a gift. 6 years she'd lived inside noise. Harlan's voice, the clatter of the trading post, the opinions of every customer who came through the door, the low, grinding hum of a man who needed an audience even when he was alone in a room. Quiet was a thing she'd had to steal in pieces, late at night, after the work was done. Now there was just the creak of leather, the dry shuffle of hooves on hard-packed ground, the wind moving through the gray prairie grass like it had somewhere to be. She rode with the ledger across her knees the whole way. Her hand kept drifting back to it, not for comfort, the way your tongue keeps going, to a sore tooth, looking for the thing that needs tending. She thought about the figures in it. Estate, $40. 70, 120, spread across 4 years in her uncle's cramped hand, under a heading that matched no freight bill she'd ever filed. And then, 18 months back, the entries stopped. What took their place was a single word land and one number beside it, $400. Received once, nothing after. Della understood accounts. She understood that money does not make itself and does not vanish without leaving a track. It comes from somewhere. It goes somewhere. And if you're patient and precise and willing to follow the numbers without flinching from where they lead, you can usually find both ends of the thread. She had a thread now. She would follow it. The sun had dropped enough to turn the sky copper and rust at its edges by the time the roof of the main house came into view. Her back ached from the ride. Her lip had stiffened where it split, and she realized, powerfully hungry. She hadn't eaten since a piece of cornbread before dawn. She said none of this. The ranch was not what she'd pictured, though she couldn't have told you what she'd pictured. It was a working place. That was the first thing about it, and the most important. not a showplace built to impress visitors. The fences were mended where they needed mending, and left plain where plain was enough. The barn was big and sound. 6 hands were in sight as they rode in, and every one of them looked up, took her measure, and went back to work with the quiet hurry of men who had things to finish before dark. One man didn't go back to work. He was maybe 55, with a grizzled beard, and the permanent squint of a man who'd spent decades reading weather. He came toward them with a rolling walk that spoke of an old hurt in the hip, healed bad and ignored a long time. "Boss," he said, nodding at Gideon. Then he looked at Della, at the dried blood on her lip, the flour dust still in her hair, the ledger on her knees. And something moved through his weathered face that was not pity and was not nosiness. It was just acknowledgement. He saw her. He didn't make a show of it. "This is Amos Reed," Gideon said. "My foreman. Amos, Miss Della Hartman. She'll be handling the household and the supply books." Amos looked at her one more beat. "You eat yet today?" It was such a plain question, so practical, that something loosened unexpectedly in her chest. "No," she said. "I'll get somebody to put a plate together." And that was the whole of it. No performance of sympathy. No remarks about the state of her. Just a need spotted and a thing done about it. She decided right then she liked Amos Reed. Off near the corral, a man was working a stretch of fence. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-skinned, moving with the unhurried economy of somebody who knew exactly how much daylight a job needed. Gideon lifted a hand as they passed. The man lifted his hammer in return. "Moses Freeman," Gideon said. "Best hand I've got. Him and Amos run this place near as much as I do." Della watched the easy way it passed between them, the plain respect of it. She noticed it the way you notice a thing, because the rest of the world has taught you not to expect it. Out past the trading post and the towns she'd known, a man like Moses Freeman would have been spoken to differently. Lower. She'd seen it her whole life and hated it the whole time, and never once had the standing to do a thing about it. She filed the moment away. This is the kind of place this is. It told her more about Gideon Marsh than anything he could have said. The room they gave her was small and plain and clean. It had a window facing east, a real bed with a real mattress, a washstand with a china basin, and a door that locked from the inside. Della stood in the middle of it a moment after Gideon left, and she looked at that lock. She felt something she hadn't felt, and so long she nearly didn't know the name of it. She felt like she could breathe. She washed her face, changed her dress, looked at her lip in the little mirror swollen, but the split was clean and would heal. She unpacked her bundle with the speed of a woman who'd learned to keep what she owned small and ready to carry. Her mother's Bible, set on the windowsill, her pen and ink, her own private record book, the one she'd kept in secret 3 years, where she'd logged every hour she worked and every dollar she'd managed to save, and the ledger. She set that in the center of the little desk. She'd be coming back to it. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread, served in the kitchen by a stout woman named Bertie Calloway, who ran the place with the cheerful authority of someone who knows her kitchen is the most important room in any building. Bertie set a plate in front of her without ceremony. "Eat it while it's hot. I don't reheat." "Yes, ma'am," Della said, and meant it. She was halfway through the plate when Gideon came in, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from her without asking, which she found she didn't mind. Normally, a man like him would eat fast and be gone, work to finish, daylight to chase. She'd seen the type, but he sat, and he stayed sitting, longer than the coffee took. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. There was, she noticed, a small girl in the doorway, 8, maybe, dark eyes, hair in 2 tight braids. She stood half hidden against the frame, watching Della the way a hungry person watches a window full of bread. "That's Pearl," Gideon said. "Moses's girl." Della set down her fork. "Hello, Pearl." The child didn't answer. Her eyes had gone to the desk in the corner of the kitchen, where Della had left her pen and her open record book while she ate. She looked at the writing on the page like it was a thing happening behind glass, close enough to see, too far to touch. "You like letters?" Della asked, gentle. Pearl's chin dipped, just barely. A yes, she wasn't sure she was allowed. "Can you read them?" The little head shook once, and the child's eyes dropped to the floor, and there was a shame in it that no 8-year-old should ever have been handed. Something turned over in Della's chest. She knew that look from the inside. She'd worn it herself, in a way the small, quiet shame of being made to feel that what you didn't have was somehow your own fault. She didn't say anything yet. It wasn't the moment, and she knew better than to make promises across a kitchen with a man she'd known half a day. But she watched the girl slip back out into the dark, and later, alone in her room, she opened the ledger under the lamp. No noise, no Harlan, no freight to shelve. For the first time in 6 years, she could look at those numbers the way they deserved to be looked at. Estate. The word sat there in her uncle's hand, dark and plain. Her mother had owned something once. Della had always known that the way you know a thing without ever being shown it. Ruth, no. Adeline. Her mother's name had been Adeline, and she had come from people with a little property, and she had never, not once, gone to bed without writing the day's accounts. Harlan had handled it all when she died, said there was nothing left, said the estate was debts, said Della was lucky to have a cot and a meal and a roof over her worthless head. Della looked at the figures. Money coming in. 4 years running. Under a word that meant something was left. Her hands were perfectly still on the page. She turned to the next entry, and the next. She would follow this. She'd follow it all the way to the bottom, however long it took. She closed the ledger, set it square in the center of the desk, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 6 years. She was at the ranch desk before sunrise, with a cup of Bertie's coffee, and every account book the place had produced in 3 years stacked in 2 neat piles beside her. Amos found her there when he came in to start his rounds. He stopped in the doorway. "You need anything?" "I need to know who kept these records before me," she said, not looking up, "and whether any of them are still on the property." Tom Hicks kept 'em last. Before Tom, it was a temporary fella. Stayed 3 months and left owing money. Before that, the boss kept him himself. "Is Hicks still here?" "Left in the spring. Got a place of his own up north." "All right." She dipped her pen. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." He stood a moment longer. "You find something wrong. You'll say so. I'll say so when I know what I've found. For now, I'm only looking." He gave a single nod, the nod of a man who respects precision, and left her to it. What she found over that first morning was not theft. It was a mess. 3 different men had kept the same kind of records in 3 entirely different ways. None of them cross-checking anything. None of them reconciling anything. Each piece accurate on its own, and the whole thing incoherent together. She figured Gideon was losing about $8 a month to nothing but disorder. $8 a month, 96 a year, over 3 years, close to $300 dissolved into plain confusion. Not stolen, just lost, which, she thought, was its own kind of crime, the kind nobody hangs for. She started building a system that would stop the bleeding. It was the second night that the young mare went into trouble. Della heard the commotion from her window. She came out to find 3 hands, and Toby Wells, a gangly boy of 19, crowded around a stall, useless with worry. The mare was down, the foal was turned wrong, and the nearest vet was a half-day's ride that the animal didn't have. Della rolled her sleeves. "Hold her head," she said. "Keep her calm, and quit crowding." Her mother had taught her this, among 100 other things, in the years before the fever took her. Della worked slow and steady, talking low to the mare, her arm in to the elbow, finding the foal's legs in the dark, turning what needed turning. It took the better part of an hour, and then there was a wet. gangly creature on the straw, and the mare's head came up, and the boys let out a breath like they'd all been holding it together. Gideon stood at the stall door. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He didn't come in. He didn't help because she hadn't needed help. He just watched the same level, unhurried attention she'd seen in the street in Cedar Gulch. And then, when it was clear the mare and foal would do, he turned and walked off into the dark without a word. In the morning, there were 2 cups of coffee outside her door. She didn't mention it. She drank them both and went to work. It was Pearl who finally cracked the thing open. The child had taken to hovering near the desk, watching the pen move. And on the 3rd afternoon, she pointed at the wooden sign hung over the ranch gate, "Still water," burned into the board, and asked, in a small voice, what it said. She couldn't read it. Not a letter. And then Moses was there, come to fetch her, and he heard the question. And Della watched a grown man's face fill with the oldest shame there is. "She don't get her letters," Moses said, quiet. "Nor do I, ma'am. I'm 40 years old, and I've never once been able to read my own name." He said it plain, the way a man owns up to a thing he's tired of carrying. There was no excuse in it, just the fact. Della set down her pen. She thought of her mother, who had been a school teacher before she was anything else, and who used to say there was no shame on earth a person was born, owing only ones the world handed them and called their own. "Mr. Freeman," she said, "listen to me a minute." He looked at her. A person who can read is a person nobody can cheat, not forever. A man can lie to your ears all day long. He can't lie to your eyes, if you know what the page says. She tapped the ledger. Half the trouble in the world runs on one person knowing what's written down and another person not. The man who keeps the book holds the power. Always has. Moses said nothing, but he was listening with his whole self. "If you'll let me," Della said, "I'll teach you. You and Pearl both. No charge. And I want to be clear on something, because it matters." She held his eyes. "This isn't charity. I'm not doing you a kindness from up high. This is a thing every soul alive should have had handed to them the day they were born. And somebody decided you shouldn't. That was a theft. Reading is yours by right. I'm just helping you take back what was always supposed to be yours." It was quiet in the room. Pearl was looking up at her father, and Moses Freeman, who Della would learn did not weep easily or often, had to look away toward the window for a moment before he could trust his voice. "All right," he said finally. "All right, ma'am, we'd be obliged." "Not obliged," Della said. "We're square. You'll work for what you learn. Same as anyone learns anything. Fair trade." Moses looked at her a long moment. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. "Fair trade," he agreed. She told no one she'd done it. But that evening, she found Gideon on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the last light leave the range. There was an empty chair beside him. She noticed he never seemed to sit in any other. "I want to use the kitchen table some evenings," she said. "After supper, I'm going to teach Moses and the girl their letters. Toby, too, if he'll come. And I think he will, though he'd sooner die than ask." Gideon was quiet a moment. "That's more than I hired you for," he said. It wasn't a complaint, just a noticing. "I know. Why?" She thought about how to say it true. "Because my mother taught me, when I had nothing else," she said. "And it was the one thing nobody could ever take back out of my hands. They took her land. They took 6 years of my work without a dollar's pay. They couldn't take this." She tapped the side of her head. "A man can steal what's in your pocket. He can't steal what's in your understanding. My mother knew that. It's the only inheritance that can't be stolen, and it's the only one I've got left to give away. So I give it." Gideon turned and looked at her in the blue dark. That same level look, like what she'd said, had weight. And he was actually setting it on the scale. "My father used to say something close to that," he said. "Said the man who owns your ignorance owns you." He couldn't read either when he was young. Taught himself off a feed catalog and a Bible. A pause, never forgot it. Then he understood, Della said. He did. She started to go in. His voice stopped her at the door quiet. Careful like, the words cost him something. My wife died 2 winters back, he said. Her name was Sarah. The baby with her. Storm came up, and I couldn't get the doctor back in time. He looked into his cup. I tell you because you ought to know the shape of the place you've walked into. That's all, not asking anything by it. Della stood very still. Thank you, she said, for not making me guess. He nodded once. Nothing else. She went inside. She sat at the desk an hour before bed and opened the ledger to the estate page in the lamplight. And there, on the next leaf, was the new word. Land. $400. Once, 18 months ago. And nothing after. Money doesn't make itself, she thought, and it doesn't disappear without leaving a track. She had 2 ends of a thread now. She just had to find what ran between them. She closed the book. Tomorrow she'd start pulling. The first lesson happened on a Tuesday evening. After the plates were cleared and the light had gone soft and orange in the kitchen windows, Della set 3 things on the table: a slate, a nub of chalk, and a sheet of paper with the alphabet, printed out in her own neat hand, big enough to read across a room. Moses Freeman sat down across from her like a man sitting down to a job he wasn't sure he could do. Pearl climbed up beside him, all eyes, and Della began the way her mother had begun with her, 20 years back, in a one-room house outside a town that didn't exist anymore. This is an A, she said. It makes 2 sounds. We'll start with the one in cat. Say it. Ah, said Pearl. Moses said nothing for a moment. Then, low, almost to self. Ah, good. That's it. That's the whole secret. Right there. Della tapped the letter. Every word you've ever heard in your life is just a handful of these, lined up. 26 little marks. That's all the world's books are made of. 26 marks and the patience to learn them. Moses looked at the row of letters like a man looking at a fence he meant to clear. 26, he said. 26. You've branded cattle with marks that mean more than these do. You learned those. You'll learn these. That landed somewhere. She watched it land. They came back the next night, and the night after. Toby Wells turned up on the 4th evening, hovering in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his ears red, pretending he'd only come for the coffee. Della pulled out a 4th slate without a word and slid it down the table to him. The boy sat. He didn't meet anybody's eye. He'd been laughed at for it before, somewhere, by somebody she could see that plain enough, and he was braced for it to happen again. It didn't. Nobody at that table had room to laugh at a man for not knowing. Most of them had been there themselves. By the 2nd week, the kitchen table had become a school. Della taught them off the ranch's own paper. Not stories, not poems. The real thing, a feed bill, a contract. The bottom line of a freight invoice. This is how they get you, she told them one night, holding a supplier's statement up to the lamp. Right here. They write 17 cents a unit in a place you don't think to look, and they count on you signing without reading. A man who can't read signs what he's handed and hopes for the best. A man who can read signs what he means to sign. She set the paper down. That's the difference between hoping and knowing. And in this life, knowing is worth more than gold. Gold runs out. Knowing doesn't. Moses studied the line where the 17 cents hid. Show me again, he said, where they put it. She showed him. He learned it. He learned it the way a man learns a thing he's been cheated by for good, all the way down. The night Moses read his own name, the whole kitchen went quiet. It was the end of the 3rd week. He'd been working at it slow and stubborn, the way he did everything. And Della had written the letters out for him a dozen times. Moses, and then Freeman, a name a freedman had chosen for himself after the war. The way a lot of them did a name that meant exactly what it said. He sounded it out under the lamp, slow, letter by letter, the chalk dust on his big hands. Moses, a breath, free, man, he stopped. Moses Freeman, he said, whole plain, his. Nobody said anything for a second. Bertie had stopped wiping the counter. Toby was staring. Pearl was looking up at her father, like she'd just watched him lift the corner of the world. Della had seen people read their names for the first time before. It never stopped doing something to her. Because it's not just the name, it's what comes with it. It's a man holding, for the first time, a thing the world spent his whole life, telling him he had no business holding. There you are, Della said quietly. That's been yours the whole time, 40 years, just waiting for you to come and take it. Moses set the chalk down very carefully, like it might break. My mama couldn't write hers, he said. Couldn't read a word. Died not able to. They wouldn't let her learn. It was against the law where she was. You understand. A law, ma'am. Against a person knowing letters. He shook his head slow. She'd have liked to see this. She'd have liked it fine. She'd be proud, Della said. And Pearl's going to write hers before she's 9. That's a thing your mama never got to dream of. You're going to hand your daughter a thing 3 generations couldn't have. Moses looked at Pearl. Pearl looked back. Yes, ma'am, he said. I expect I am. Gideon took to standing in the doorway during the lessons, not joining, just there, shoulder against the frame, coffee in hand, watching the lamplight and the bent heads and the slow scratch of chalk. Della pretended not to notice. She'd learned a man like him needed room to come to a thing in his own time. One night, Pearl wore herself out and fell asleep right there at the table, her cheek on her arm, halfway through her letters. And before Della could move to take her, Gideon crossed the room and gathered the child up easy against his shoulder. He stood there a moment, the little girl breathing slow against his collar. And something happened in his face. Della saw it. She made herself not look too long, but she saw it the way the man went still, the way something old and buried rose up in him and pressed close to the surface and ached there. His own child would have been near this age, if the storm had let it live. He didn't say a word. He just held Pearl a moment longer than carrying her required. His hand came up and cupped the back of the small braided head, gentle as anything Della had ever seen. Then he carried her out to the bunkhouse where Moses waited, and he came back, and he didn't speak of it, and neither did she. But the next morning there were 3 cups of coffee outside her door. She didn't ask what the third one meant. Some things you let a man say in his own language. It was on a porch night near the end of that week that the letter came up. She'd told Gideon already about Cedar Gulch, about Harlan, about 6 years of work for no pay. But she hadn't told him the rest. The estate entries, the land entry, the $400 sitting alone in the book, like a door, slammed shut too fast. She told him now. He listened the whole way through without once interrupting, which she was coming to understand was simply how he listened. When she finished, he was quiet a while. You think he stole something off you, he said. I think my mother left something. Money, land, a right of some kind. And I think Harlan's been drawing income off it for years while looking me in the face and telling me there was nothing. She turned the ledger in her hands. I can read it now. That's the thing he never counted on. He kept his own books and figured the one person who'd ever see them couldn't add. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about it for 6 years. What do you mean to do? Find the other end of the thread. There'll be a deed somewhere. Records. Paper doesn't lie. The way people do, that's the whole beauty of it. She looked out at the dark range. A man can swear black as white to your face, but the courthouse keeps a record, and the record just sits there being true, however much he'd rather it didn't. Gideon nodded slow. Then, lighter than the rest of it, my mother used to say the same thing you keep saying about reading. She got it from her mother. A pause. Said a woman who keeps her own accounts is a woman nobody can keep. Della went still. That's exactly right, she said. That's exactly the whole of it. He looked at her in the dark a moment. I figured you'd say so, he said. And somewhere out past the corral, a single coyote called and was answered by another. And the night settled down warm and quiet over Stillwater Ranch. A problem, Della thought, turning the ledger over once more in her hands. No, not a problem. An opportunity. The storm came up out of the southwest on a Thursday, fast and mean, the way summer storms do when the land's been dry too long and the sky finally decides to make up for it all at once. It caught everybody home, at least. The hands were in from the range. Moses and Pearl had come up to the main house for the evening lesson and gotten trapped by the first wall of rain, and Gideon told them plain. There was no sense risking the walk to the bunkhouse in it. So they stayed. Bertie made up pallets. The wind threw itself against the walls, and the rain came down like the roof was the only thing between them and a river. There was no drama to it. That was the strange part. Just a long, wet night, a house full of people, and a fire in the kitchen stove that nobody wanted to leave. They did lessons by lamplight while the storm howled. Pearl read 3 whole words off the slate without help, and Moses got through a full line of the feed bill, slow and certain, and Toby, to his own visible shock, wrote his name without looking at the copy. There was something about the storm that loosened them all up, made the warm room feel like the only room in the world. You hear that, Della said, at one point, when the thunder rolled long and close. Hard not to, said Toby. 20 years ago, I'd have been scared half to death of it. My mother taught me the trick. She tapped her temple. She'd say a storm is just weather. It doesn't know you're here. It isn't after you. Fear of a thing is mostly not understanding it. Learn how a thing works, and most of the fear goes out of it. She smiled a little. Same with a contract. Same with a man like my uncle. Same with most things that scare people. The not knowing is the worst part. Knowing you can stand. Moses looked up from his slate. That's a true thing, he said. It's the truest thing I know, said Della. They drifted off to their pallets, one by one, as the night wore on. First, then Toby. Then Bertie behind the curtain off the kitchen. Moses stretched out near the stove. The lamp got turned down low. Della couldn't sleep. The storm had eased to a steady patter, and she lay a while, listening to it. And then she got up quiet for a drink of water. The house was dark, but for one low light. It was coming from the front room. She came around the corner and stopped. Gideon was sitting alone in the dark by the cold front window. The empty chair was beside him, the one he never let anybody sit in, and his head was bowed, and his shoulders were doing something she had never once seen them do. He was crying, not loud, not the way people cry when they want it heard. The silent, wrung-out kind, the kind a man does when he's certain he's the only soul awake in the world. His hand was flat on the arm of that empty chair like he was holding on to it, like it was the last edge of something he was about to go over. A storm like this one, Della understood, all at once. A storm just like this one, 2 winters back. The night he couldn't get the doctor home. She did not go to him. She understood, in the marrow of her, that this was not a thing she was meant to witness, and that the kindest thing she could do, the only decent thing, was to let him have it alone, to not make him perform being all right for her sake, to not turn his grief into something he then had to manage for her comfort. So she stepped back into the dark, careful and silent, and she went back to her pallet, and she let him be. But she didn't forget what she'd seen. In the gray of the morning, with the storm blown out and the world dripping and clean, she found his work shirt. It had been left over a chair. By the kitchen door, the left sleeve split clean along the seam, waiting on mending that nobody'd gotten to. Bertie's hands were already full with the breakfast. Della sat down with it before anyone was much awake, and she mended the sleeve by the gray window light. Small, even stitches, the way her mother had taught her. It took 20 minutes. She folded the shirt and set it back on the chair and said nothing to a living soul about it. She didn't do it to be thanked. She did it because she had seen a man at the worst hour of his night, alone with a grief too big to carry. And there was nothing on this earth she could do about the size of it. But she could mend a sleeve. She could do one small thing, asked of her by no one, that said, without a single word having to be spoken, I see you. You don't have to be all right. I'm not going to make you say so. When Gideon came down and found the shirt, he held it a moment, turned the mended sleeve over in his fingers. He looked up, and across the kitchen, his eyes found hers. Just for a second, he knew. She watched him know it. And she watched him understand the rest of it, too, that she'd seen him in the dark, and said nothing, and asked nothing, and only mended the sleeve. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The next morning, there were 3 cups of coffee outside her door again, and tucked under the third, folded small, a $5 note. She came out onto the porch with it. "What's this?" she said. "A head on your wages," Gideon said, not looking at her, looking at the wet range. "Figure a person ought to have a little money of her own. Money nobody can take back." Seemed like a thing you'd understand. Della stood there holding the note. "That is a thing I understand," she said. Figured. She wrote the letter that afternoon. It had come 3 days back. In the post, Amos brought up from town a stiff, lawyerly thing from a man named Hatch, a solicitor out of Cheyenne, written in the dense, weaponized language that exists to hide a simple meaning behind expensive words. She'd stripped it down to its bones. Harlan Pike wanted the ledger back within 10 days, or he'd pursue what the letter called legal remedy. He didn't want his property. He wanted his evidence gone. She wrote her answer in 3 drafts. The first was the one she wanted to write every figure, every discrepancy. 4 years of it laid out cold. The second was shorter, the same blade with less of the handle. The third was the one she actually sent, a single paragraph, polite as a closed door. She informed Mr. Hatch that the ledger in question was the working record of the Pike's Crossing trading post, that it contained entries made in her own hand in the course of 6 years' unpaid labor, that she had questions about certain other entries she believed a territorial court would find equally interesting, and that she would welcome the chance to discuss the matter before any proceedings were begun. She read it back once, sealed it, handed it to Amos for the post. "What's it say?" he asked. "A polite invitation," she said, for him to think harder. She went back to the desk. She had a thread, 2 ends of it now, and a man on the other side of the territory who wanted it burned, which told her, better than anything else could have, that it led somewhere worth the going. Outside, the cottonwoods dripped in the clean-washed light, and for the first time in a long time, the air smelled like something growing. She found the missing money on the 6th day. She'd been reconciling the past year's cattle sales against the bank deposits. Amos had handed over matching sale dates to head counts, to per head prices, to what had actually landed in the account. Slow work, the kind most people haven't the patience for. Della had nothing but patience, and there it was. A sale from 8 months back, 42 head at $9 a head, $378, the receipt said, but the deposit that matched it ran $38 short. Not a rounding error, not $8 lost to confusion, the way the rest of it had been. $38, clean and exact. She sat very still a moment. Then she went back through the records and found 2 more. 3 sales over 18 months, short by 31, 38, 44, $113. Received by the ranch. Never deposited. This was not disorder. Disorder is random. It scatters. This was tidy. This had a shape, and a thing with a shape has a hand behind it. She put her pen down and waited. Gideon came in from the afternoon pasture work, dusty and tired, and he took one look at her face and stopped in the doorway. "What?" he said. "Sit down, please." He sat. She laid it out for him the way she'd found it. Dates, amounts, the gap between what the receipt said came in and what the bank said went in. She didn't dress it up. She didn't editorialize. She just put the facts down in the order she'd found them and let the numbers do their own talking. Because numbers, in her experience, were better at telling the truth than people ever were. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment. Tom Hicks kept the books that whole stretch, he said. Yes, and the hand on these sale receipts matches the hand in his other entries. I can show you the comparison side by side if you want it. His jaw had gone tight. His hands on the desk were still. $113, he said. Yes, that's 2 months' wages for the whole crew. Yes, he breathed out through his nose. Slow, you'd never have caught it, Della said quietly. Not because you're careless, because the man counted on it. He kept the books, and he figured whoever came after wouldn't read them close enough to see. That's the whole trick, every time. It always comes down to one person who knows what's on the page and another who doesn't bother to look. He bet on you not looking. She tapped the ledger. He just didn't figure on me. Gideon looked at the book, then at her. Do you have enough to take to the law? She considered it honestly. She always considered it honestly. I have enough to show a strong pattern. Whether it proves he meant to steal, whether it's theft or just sloppiness that happened to favor his pocket. That depends on whether he can account for the gap. He likely can't. But I'll tell you where I stand on it. She met his eyes. I'll prepare the documentation. All of it. Clean in order. What you do with it after that is your decision. Not mine. You're awful careful about that, Gideon said. About not deciding things that aren't yours to decide. I had decisions made for me without my say for 6 years, Della said. Every one of them. Where I slept, what I ate, what I was worth. I swore I'd never do that to another living soul if I could help it. A person's choices are theirs, even the wrong ones. Especially the wrong ones. She paused. That's the thing nobody ever gave me, so I give it where I can. Gideon held her gaze 3 full seconds. No, he said quietly. I don't reckon you would. He reached across and closed the ledger. Gentle, and his hand brushed her fingers in the doing of it. A touch so brief she might have imagined it. Except she didn't imagine things. That was rather the whole problem with her. I'll handle Hicks, he said. You get the papers ready. Already started. He almost smiled. Not quite. Della, he said. Thank you. And the plainness of it, no speech. No weight hung on it. Just 2 words set down without any debt attached. Stopped something in her chest for a beat before it started again. It's what you pay me for, she said. It isn't actually. I pay you for the supply books. This is considerably more than that. She looked at her pen. I notice things. I always have. It's not something I can turn off. I know, he said. I noticed that. It was Toby who tore his arm open on the barbed wire 2 days later. A clean catch, but deep. Bleeding steady by the time he made the yard. Bertie was off to town with Amos. Gideon was out at the far pasture. So Della set down her pen, took one look, fetched the supply box from the kitchen, and had the cut cleaned, packed, and bound before the boy, fully registered that the bookkeeper was the one stitching him up. You've done this before. Ma'am, he said, watching her work, eyes a little wide. Yes, hold still. Where'd you learn? My mother. And 6 years of being the only person in a building who thought one step ahead of trouble. She tied off the binding. Change the dressing tomorrow. If it goes red at the edges, you come find me before you go to anybody else. Toby was quiet a moment. You're real different than we figured you'd be, he said. She looked up from the bandage. And what did you figure I'd be? He had the grace to look sheepish. Fragile, I reckon. Boss brought you in looking like somebody'd hurt you. We thought he stopped. Wasn't our place to think anything. No, Della said, not unkindly, but for what it's worth. I'm not fragile. I've just had a long time to learn how to take a hit and keep standing. She sat back. Those aren't the same thing. Being soft and being hurt. People mix them up. A person can be hurt bad and be hard as iron underneath. The hurt's just what happened to them. It isn't what they are. Toby looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more of around the ranch lately. The look of a person quietly revising something they hadn't known they'd assumed. Yes, ma'am, he said. And there was something different in it this time. Not quite gratitude. More like the start of plain, unfussy respect. It was Pearl who said the thing out loud, the way children do. They were all at supper. The talk had gone easy and warm, and out of a long, companionable quiet. The little girl looked up from her plate and asked, simple as asking the time, "Miss Della, can you stay here for good?" The table went still. Della didn't look at Gideon. Gideon didn't look at Della. Pearl, sensing she'd dropped something she couldn't see, slid down from her chair and wandered off after a barn cat. And the two of them sat there, and they were still not looking at each other, and neither one said a word. It went on a beat too long to mean nothing. They both knew it. The whole table knew it. Bertie made a great show of needing something from the stove. It was Gideon who finally broke it, and he did it sideways. The coward's mercy of changing the subject. "You said you wanted to go to Cheyenne." "I do." Della took up the lifeline gratefully. "The county land office. If my mother owned property, there's a deed on file. If that deed got transferred, there's a record of that too. Paper keeps. Whatever Harlan told me, whatever story, he sold the territory. There's a true account sitting in a courthouse drawer. And it doesn't care what he says. That's what I keep telling Moses. The record just sits there being true. You only have to go and read it. 2 days' ride," Gideon said. "I know. I've business at the land office myself. Fence line dispute with a neighbor wants the survey records. I was going to go next month." He turned his coffee cup once on the table. "I could go Saturday instead. Take you." A pause. "Unless you'd rather go alone." She considered it honestly. She was capable of going alone. She had $12 and 3 weeks' wages and a $5 note that was hers and nobody's to take back. 18, $19. Enough, but it was 2 days' ride. And she didn't know the road. And Gideon Marsh's name, she'd come to learn, meant something in this territory that hers did not. And she admitted to herself, with only a small argument safer with him than without him, which was a thing she'd have died before saying about any man alive a month ago. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. They left before dawn with 2 horses and provisions for the road, and Della brought her own record book and every note she'd made, organized into a leather folder she'd stitched together from scraps in the supply room. The ride was long and mostly silent, but it was a different silence than the one they'd shared the first day. That one had been 2 strangers thrown together. This one had texture to it, the easy quiet of people who'd already said the important things and didn't need to fill the air to prove they were there. Mid-morning of the first day, Gideon spoke without prompting. "My father bought this land in '59, he said. "Fought for every acre of it. Indians, weather, a banker or two." A pause. "He died knowing it was solid. That's about the best a man can ask, I figure. To leave a thing standing." "Did you ever think of leaving it?" Della asked. "After." He was quiet a while. "After Sarah. I thought about it every day for a year," he said. Couldn't see the point of any of it. The ranch ran. Cattle moved. Books got kept, after a fashion, to anybody watching. That's a working man. He looked at the road, but I wasn't there. Not really. Not in any way that counted. I got up and I did the work, and I went to bed, and the days went by, and I wasn't in a single one of them. Della didn't say anything right off. She understood that kind of honesty was easier said to a road than to a face. "And now?" she finally asked. Gideon glanced over at her. "Now I'm here," he said. He left it at that. So did she. But something in her chest sat a little warmer the rest of that day's ride. They camped one night on the trail and reached Cheyenne by noon of the second day. Gideon took the horses to the livery and went off to deal with his fence line. Della went straight to the county land office. The clerk was a small, harried man named Fenwick, who plainly did not see many women come in asking after deed records, and plainly did not know whether to talk down to her or fall over himself helping. Della gave him room for neither. "I'm looking for any property deed recorded under the name Ruth Whitfield," she said, "or Adeline Darnell. That was my mother's maiden name. Anything. in the 10 years before 1878, and any transfer of either recorded after that. Please. He found it in 20 minutes. Her mother had owned a parcel outside Cedar Gulch, 12 acres, a standing house, and a water, right to a seasonal creek that ran the northeast corner of the property, which, in a drought country, was the most valuable thing on it by far. She'd owned it outright. No lien, no debt, no encumbrance. The deed recorded clean in her own name, and in the second year after her death, the deed had been transferred to Harlan Pike. Della's hand stayed perfectly steady on the counter. She'd known this was likely. She'd followed the numbers here precisely because she expected it. She had braced for it. And still reading her mother's name on that deed. And then, reading the date the land was taken out from under it, something moved through her that she had not entirely braced for. Not grief. Exactly. Something older than grief. The particular ache of finally understanding the whole shape of a thing that had been done to you in the dark for years, while you slept on a cot, believing there was nothing. I need a certified copy of both, she said. Her voice did not shake. The original deed and the transfer, whatever it costs. She was sitting on the office steps with the certified copies in her folder when Gideon found her 20 minutes later. He took one look at her face and sat down beside her on the step without a word. She showed him. He read it. He transferred it to himself. Gideon said, 2 years after she died. No will, you said. None recorded. And in the absence of a will, the property goes to the nearest blood heir. That's me. I was 16. He was my guardian. He used a thing that's supposed to protect a child to take what was mine. She looked at the deed. That's the part I keep coming back to. Guardianship's meant to be a shield. He made it a key. Unlocked the one door he was sworn to stand in front of. And the $400, Gideon said. He sold it 18 months ago to whoever's running the railroad land up that way. She'd checked the secondary records while Fenwick made the copies. The buyer was a Cheyenne outfit called the Renner Land Company, and the name had stopped her cold because Renner was the very speculator who'd been sitting in Harlan's back room the day she was thrown into the street. He drew income off the water right for years. Those are the estate entries. Then he sold the land out from under it. My land, my mother's land, that was supposed to come to me. Gideon was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, it was with a careful, level evenness she'd learned to recognize as controlled anger. What do we do? He said. Not are you sure? Not that's a serious thing to claim. Just what do we do? There's a territorial attorney 3 blocks from here, Della said. I have the deed. I have the transfer with a signature that may not hold up. I have the ledger showing income he took and never told me about. And I have 3 years of my own records of unpaid labor, which under territorial law is a debt owed. That's enough to open a case. She paused. Whether it's enough to win depends on things I don't control, but it's enough to open the door. Then we opened the door, Gideon said. The attorney was a heavy-set man named Crane, with sharp eyes behind thick spectacles. And he listened to Della for 45 minutes without once cutting in. He examined the deed, the transfer, the transcribed ledger entries with their dates and amounts. He asked 6 precise questions, and Della answered all 6 without a stumble. Then, at the end, he leaned back and looked at her over the rims of his glasses. Miss Hartman, you kept personal records of your own labor through this whole period. Yes, sir. 3 years of them. Hours worked. Tasks done. Fair market value for each. And you're prepared to swear to all of it. Yes, sir. Crane set the papers down, folded his hands. I've practiced law in this territory 19 years, he said, and I'll tell you honest cases of this kind. Estate fraud, improper guardianship, a girl's inheritance walked off with by the man, set to mind it. They're not simple. They take time. They face resistance. Men like your uncle have connections, and they use them. He paused. But I'll also tell you that the documentation you've laid in front of me is among the cleanest I have ever seen on a case like this. You've done most of my work for me, young lady. It was then that Crane said the thing Della would not forget. You'd be surprised, he said almost to himself, how often these cases come to me too late, or not at all. A woman loses what's hers and never even knows she had a claim. She can't read the deed, doesn't know the law, gives her standing by the time anybody tells her. The trail's cold. He shook his head. The wrong gets done in the gap between what a person owns and what they know they own. That gap is where men like your uncle live. Della felt something settle in her, hard and clear as a struck nail. That gap, she said, is exactly what I mean to spend the rest of my life closing. Crane looked at her a moment, like he was filing something away. I'll file a petition with the territorial court to have the transfer reviewed, he said. In the meantime, do not return that ledger. Forward anything from the Cheyenne solicitor straight to me. And Miss Hartman. He looked at her steady. Stay out of Cedar Gulch until this is settled. A cornered man does foolish things, and your uncle is about to feel very cornered. I understand, Della said. She did not yet understand the half of it. They were 2 hours from the ranch when they saw the rider coming south at speed. It was Toby, his face tight in a way that closed Della's chest before he'd said a word. Boss, he pulled up hard. You got to know. Man came to the ranch yesterday. Big fella. Said his name was Dawes. He swallowed. Said he had business with Miss Hartman. Said he'd be back. The name landed on Della like a cold hand on her spine. Dawes. The railroad surveyor from Harlan's back room. Dawes, who'd helped sell her mother's land. Dawes, who was no surveyor at all, but the hand that did the dirty middle of the deal. And he'd come to the ranch, which meant Harlan knew where she was. The timeline she'd counted on had just collapsed. How long ago? Gideon said. Walt run him off twice. He didn't go far. Gideon put his heels to his horse, and they rode the last of it hard. Harlan came the next morning. 4 horses, which told Della all she needed to know. This was a show of force, not a talk. She walked out into the yard with her hands free and her back straight, and she did not let herself hurry. Harlan sat his gray with Dawes on one side, and Renner, the landman, on the other, and a 4th man behind them carrying himself with the blank stillness of somebody paid to frighten people. Amos was already in the yard. 3 hands had drifted into places that weren't accidents. Moses stood near the trough, quiet. Gideon came out of the barn and crossed to stand at Della's left. Close. He did not reach for his gun. You've got something of mine, Harlan said. Good morning, Harlan. It threw him. Pleasantries from the girl who'd only ever answered him with silence. He blinked. The ledger and whatever copies you made. I want them. I'm afraid that's not possible. His face went red. That book is property of Pike's Crossing. Every entry in my hand is mine, Della said. Every entry in your hand is evidence. Your solicitor's letter went to my attorney in Cheyenne 3 days ago. Direct all future correspondence to him. The yard held its breath. Your attorney, Harlan said. You haven't got money for an attorney. I do now. $2 a week adds up. She let that sit. And the property you stole adds up to considerably more. The words dropped into the yard like a stone in still water. My mother owned 12 acres and a house outside Cedar Gulch, Della said, level and clear, not looking away from his face. Owned it outright, with a water right. She left no will, which under territorial law means her estate passed to her nearest blood heir. That's me. I was 16, and you were my guardian. And you used that to sign her land over to yourself. I have the certified copies from the Cheyenne Land Office. I have your own ledger showing 4 years of water income you took and never told me of. And I have the record of the sale to Mr. Renner's company for $400. Her eyes went to Renner, which I suspect Mr. Renner will be very interested to revisit, seeing as the title he bought may not have been clean. The Renner's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted. and Della knew her arrow had found the mark. Harlan swung down off his horse, moving before his boots hit the dirt, fast and ugly. No plan in it, just the need to close the distance, because he had nothing left. Gideon stepped forward. One step between them. He did not reach for his gun. He just stood there, and the look on his face was not anger, and not show, it was the flat, absolute refusal of a man who had decided a thing and would not be moved off it. Back up, Mr. Pike. Harlan stopped 2 feet from him. This is between me and her. You stopped having anything between you and her the day you put your hand on her in the street, Gideon said. Back up. Amos moved. 2 hands moved with him. The arithmetic of the yard got very plain. Harlan backed up not because he wanted to, because the alternative had gotten obvious. His face was doing something terrible. The collapse of a man who'd built his whole self on the certainty that the people beneath him would stay beneath him, watching one of them stand. You've got nothing, he said. But the conviction had drained out of it. Some numbers in a book. Your mama was a sneak and a liar. Same as don't, Della said. Quiet. It stopped him cold. You called my mother difficult her whole life. You called me ungrateful. You called Moses there worthless, and a poor child not worth teaching her letters. You know why? She took one step toward the truth of it, because every one of us could see you. Plain. All the way through. Your whole life you've called people truable, when what you meant was, they're not fooled. And the thing you fear most in the world is a person who can read what you wrote down, because then we don't need you anymore. We never did. The yard was dead silent. Dawes looked at his boots. Renner looked at the middle distance, with the face of a man counting his own exposure. Harlan looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she watched her uncle look small. You'll regret this, he said. It was all he had. No, Della said. I really don't think I will. He looked at Gideon. Whatever he saw there ended it. He remounted. They wheeled and rode south. The smoke came an hour later. Boss Amos, from the yard. South Ridge, that's the hayshed. A black column already. Fast and thick. And in the same breath, Della's mind clicked cold. Pearl had said she was going to the hayshed this morning to find her primer. Pearl, Della said. Gideon was already running. The shed was full ablaze when they reached it, the doors swollen shut with heat. Gideon hit them with his shoulder, and the smoke rolled out, thick enough to take your breath before your mind caught up. Pearl, a cough, from the far corner. Ragged, but there. Della pulled her collar over her mouth and went in behind him, through the heat like a wall, the fire eating the dry timber overhead with a sound like something enormous and hungry. The girl was down, one small leg pinned under a fallen beam, the hay around it catching. Gideon got his hands under the beam and lifted. Della saw the whole of him strain. It moved 3 inches. Enough? Pull her. She grabbed Pearl under the arms and pulled, and the child came free. And Gideon dropped the beam and got an arm around the girl, and they ran for the doors. The roof came down behind them as they cleared it a deep, giving up groan, and then a roar of heat that shoved all 3 of them out into the yard and onto their knees in the dirt. Della coughed until her eyes streamed. When she could see, Moses was there, gathering up his daughter, his big hands shaking. She's breathing, he said. She's breathing. Thank God. Gideon's hand was on Della's back. You're all right. Not a question. He was checking her face, the way he did when he was frightened. Everything stripped down to the bone of it. I'm all right, she said. Behind them, the hayshed folded in on itself in fire and smoke, and Della, kneeling in the dirt with the heat on her back, looked at the road south where 4 horses had gone. Harlan did this, she said, or Dawes on his word. Gideon said. Same order, either way. She got to her feet. Her hands were steady now. This isn't a state fraud anymore, she said. This is arson. And a child. Sheriff needs everything. She looked at Moses, at Pearl, breathing in his arms. And I need to write to Crane tonight. I know, Gideon said. She looked at him. Are you all right? He asked. not the smoke. The whole of it. Yes, she said. And then because it was true, and she was done being careful with the true things, because I'm not in it alone. The marshal arrived 4 days later. A spare, precise man named Hollis, who read Della's documentation with the concentrated attention of a man who'd realized at once that she had done most of his work for him. Dawes was arrested for the arson. He held out about 4 hours before his lawyer took one look at the papers and told him cooperation was the only road left with any sense in it. So Dawes talked. He gave them Harlan. The whole arrangement, the land sale, the deed paperwork, the 4 years of water income split between them, and the fire, set on Harlan's order to burn the evidence before the marshal came. But spoken words from a cornered man are a soft thing in a courtroom. Renner's lawyers would call Dawes a liar, saving his own neck, and they'd likely make it stick. The thing that broke it open was a sheet of paper, and the man who broke it open was Moses Freeman. He came to Della the morning the marshal was due to leave, holding something folded in his big hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been carrying this since the night before the fire. Didn't rightly know what it was till I could read it." He set it on the desk. "Dawes come to me that evening," Moses said, "out by the bunkhouse, where nobody'd see. Friendly, as you please. Said he had work for me. Said sign here. It's just a hire paper." And he put $1 in my hand. Moses's jaw worked. Year ago, I'd have signed it. I'd have taken the $1 and made my mark and never known what I put my name to. Della looked at the paper. It was a receipt, crude but plain a record of payment, for services at the Marsh property, by fire, with a line at the bottom for Moses Freeman's mark. Dawes had meant to buy himself a witness who couldn't read the trap, a man to share the blame. His name on the very thing they aimed to do gambling, the way men like him always gambled, that a freedman couldn't read what was put in front of him. "But I read it," Moses said. His voice was steady now, and there was something in it Della had never heard before. "I stood there in the dark, and I read every word. Slow, the way you taught me, and I knew what it was. So I didn't sign. I told him I'd think on it, and I folded it up, and I kept it." He looked at her. He never knew I could read it. That's the thing. He looked at me and saw a man who couldn't, and he was wrong. Della picked the paper up with care, the way you pick up something that's worth a life. "Moses," she said quietly, "do you know what this is?" "I expect it's the thing that hangs him. It's the thing that proves the fire was planned, in his own writing, in his own hand, days before. No jury in the territory will call that a story now." She set it down. "You held the one thing they can't argue with, and you only held it because you could read it." Moses Freeman looked at her a long moment. "You told me once," he said. "First week I sat at that table. You said a man who can read is a man nobody can cheat. Not forever. A breath. I didn't half believe you. I do now. I surely do now." Moses stood before Marshal Hollis that afternoon and read his own statement aloud, every word of it, in his own hand, in a voice that did not shake. Hollis listened the whole way through. And when it was done, he looked at the freedman a long beat. And then he wrote something in his book and underlined it twice. Harlan Pike was arrested in Cedar Gulch on a Tuesday morning. Estate fraud, improper guardianship, conspiracy to arson, the attempted killing of a child. Renner's company cut him loose so fast it was almost funny. His solicitor withdrew before the ink dried. The bank account her mother had hidden. The one Crane turned up, misfiled under the wrong name, came to $160-some with the interest. The land would be made good in money, if not in dirt. It was over, or near enough to over that the rest was only paperwork. And paperwork held no fear for Della Hartman. It was an ordinary evening when Gideon said the thing. They were down by the fence line, the light going gold, and he was looking out at the range when he spoke, plain as fixing a post. "I don't want to check this fence alone anymore," he said. Della went still. "And that chair on the porch, the empty one." He didn't look at her. "I'd like it to have somebody in it." Now he did look. I've been counting. You've been here 42 days. I remember the day you laughed the first time. Toby said something. Fool about a bandage. And you laughed like you'd forgot you were allowed. Something warm and frightening turned over in her chest. I'm going to be a great deal of work, she said. Not a warning, a fact. I figure honest accounts are exactly what I need, he said. And the echo of his own words from that first day in the street caught her breath, because he'd remembered, and he'd meant it then, and he meant it more now. I'm not going to stop, she said. The books, the teaching, there's a thing I mean to build, and it doesn't shrink to fit a man's porch. I know, Gideon said. I wasn't asking you to fit. I was asking to stand next to it, not run it, not rescue it, just be beside it. A pause. Beside you. Della looked at the man who had ridden into a street and said 4 words, and stayed when the crowd left. Yes, she said, I'll let you be beside it. 6 months later, on a morning in early spring, when the desert had briefly remembered how to be green, Della Hartman set a sign in a window on the east side of Cedar Gulch. The Adeline School, it said. Reading, writing, ledgers and your rights. Pay what you can. No one turned away. She'd named it for her mother. The schoolteacher, who dreamed of a little school for poor children and died, believing she'd left nothing behind. Crane's last letter had told the whole of it. Adeline had set that bank money aside on purpose, with a note, near the end, when she knew she was dying, to teach reading to any child who wants it, rich or poor, white or black, no exceptions. She had left her daughter the one inheritance Harlan Pike could never reach. Not the land, the reason for it. Gideon stood in the street, looking at the sign. You didn't put my name on it, he said. It's my name, she said. It is, he agreed. And there was nothing in it but plain, uncomplicated pride. The first appointment came at 9. A woman named Margaret, 43, whose husband had died in the winter, and whose brother-in-law had told her she had no claim to the family. Farm, her name wasn't on the deed, he said, so it wasn't hers. Della sat down across from her at the desk. Tell me what you have, she said. Start at the beginning. I'm going to take notes. She took them, careful, comprehensive, in her even reliable hand. Every date, every asset, everything the brother-in-law had said, and exactly why each of those things was or was not true under the law. He's counting on you not knowing, Della told her. That's the whole of his power. The gap between what's yours and what you know is yours. We're going to close that gap right now, this morning. And once it's closed, he can't open it again. She slid 3 pages across the desk. You have far more standing than he's let you believe. Here's what you've got. Here's what it means. Here's what you do next. And here's the name of a good attorney in Cheyenne. Margaret left an hour later, with her chin up. Della watched her go. Then she turned back to her desk, opened her record book to a fresh page, and wrote the date at the top. The time the story leaps now is 8 years. By the spring of 1892, the Adeline School had taught half the valley to read. Pearl, 16 now, ran the beginners class herself. Moses Freeman kept the books for ranchers up and down the territory. A freedman, whose word and whose ledger were trusted from one end of the county to the other. Toby read the newspaper aloud to the Stillwater hands every evening, slow and proud, on the porch of the main house. Gideon Marsh drank his coffee at dawn, looking out over the range. There were 2 cups on the rail now. There had been for a long time. The empty chair was not empty. It hadn't been in years. Out in the yard, a small girl named Sarah Adeline was learning to sit a very old gray mare named Juno, and Gideon stood at her stirrup with one hand on the bridle, telling her low and patient to keep her heels down. He glanced up at the porch, where her mother sat with a ledger and a cup of coffee, and he remembered, for just a moment, a street in Cedar Gulch and a horse he hadn't wanted to stop and had stopped anyway. Della watched her husband teach her daughter to ride, and she thought of the first thing she'd ever trusted about him, the way he was with that mare. gentle in a way that didn't need to prove itself. It was still true. After everything, it was still true. She bent back to her book and wrote the morning's date at the top of a fresh page.
The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. Della Hartman's journey reminds us that the greatest theft is not always the loss of money, land, or property. Sometimes, the greatest theft is convincing a person that they are powerless, that they are worth less than they truly are, or that they have no right to ask questions. For 6 long years, Della was denied not only her inheritance, but also her voice. Yet the one thing her uncle could never take from her was her ability to think, to learn, and to understand. In the end, it was not a gun, a fist, or even a courtroom that defeated corruption. It was knowledge. It was a woman who could read the records, follow the numbers, and uncover the truth. The story also teaches us that kindness is most powerful when it expects nothing in return. Gideon Marsh never rescued Della because he wanted praise or admiration. He simply chose to do what was right when everyone else chose to look away. His courage reminds us that character is revealed not in grand speeches, but in quiet decisions. Sometimes changing a life begins with something as simple as saying, "That's enough," when everyone else remains silent. Another beautiful lesson comes through the transformation of Moses, Freeman, and Pearl. Their journey shows that education is not merely about reading words on a page. Education is freedom. It is independence. It is protection against those who would exploit ignorance for their own gain. When Moses learned to read his own name, he gained much more than literacy. He gained ownership of his future. And when he was able to expose a criminal scheme because he could read the document placed before him, the story proved a timeless truth. Knowledge empowers ordinary people to defend themselves against extraordinary injustice. Perhaps the most touching message of all is that healing does not happen alone. Della carried wounds that were invisible to most people. Gideon carried grief that he rarely spoke about. Yet neither of them healed by being rescued. They healed because they found people who respected them, believed them, and stood beside them. Real love is not about saving someone. It is about walking beside them while they discover their own strength. The story also reminds us that our greatest legacy is often not what we leave behind, but what we pass forward. Adeline's land was stolen. Her savings nearly disappeared. But the values she taught her daughter endured. Through Della, those lessons spread to an entire community. One woman's belief in education changed countless lives. Children learned to read. Adults learned their rights. Families learned to protect what belonged to them. A single act of teaching became a legacy that stretched far beyond one lifetime. In a world where many people still feel overlooked, underestimated, or unheard, Della's story offers hope. It tells us that our past does not determine our future. It tells us that dignity can survive hardship, that truth can survive deception, and that courage can survive fear. Most importantly, it reminds us that no one is truly powerless when they possess knowledge, integrity, and the willingness to keep standing after every fall. So, if there is one lesson to carry away from this story, let it be this: never underestimate the value of learning. Never underestimate the strength of a good heart. And never underestimate the impact of one person who chooses to do the right thing. Because sometimes, a single person willing to stand up for truth can change not only their own life, but the lives of generations that follow. And that is exactly what Della Hartman did.